With that, I would like to just remind everybody to stay muted, please, and to put any questions that you have in the chat. We will be monitoring the questions, and any questions for presenters we'll go through at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Paul Gray. So Paul Gray is the science coordinator for the Audubon, Florida's Everglades Restoration Program. He's based out of Highlands County near the Kissimmee River and has been working in Florida for 36 years, with the last 29 for Audubon. His educational background includes a Bachelor of Science from the University of Missouri and a master's from Texas Tech University and his PhD from the University of Florida. Paul provides technical support to Audubon policy teams on water, land, and bird management issues primarily related to Lake Okeechobee, but statewide issues as needed. This work entails representing Audubon in public and private meetings and helping develop Audubon oral and written comments on various policy and technical issues. He's a charter member of the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow Working Group and a former co-chair of the Snail Kite Coordinating Committee. Waterfowl talk is one of his favorite to give, and I'm so excited for him to be able to present for us tonight. So, Paul, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, can you see that?
We can see it, yep.
Okay, let me start the slideshow. Okay, so we set?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, good night, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I've already got my slides out of sequence. Okay, so as Sabina let you all know, I'm a staff scientist for Audubon. I work in our Everglades program. My primary work is on Lake Okeechobee, and I have a talk on that that's pretty policy heavy about what's going on with the lake and what we need to do. This talk is more of just a fun talk. When I was at Mizzou, I took ornithology and really liked it. I wanted to work with songbirds, but there wasn't much money in non-game research. And as a kid, Dad had taken me hunting and fishing and stuff like that, and my brothers. And so we hunted waterfowl and quail and all that. And so I really liked waterfowl. So I went into waterfowl academically because since they are hunted, there's plenty of funding. And so now I work for Audubon. I've come full circle. I can work on all the different kinds of birds, but this is just a talk about a group of birds that I just really love and have had a long relationship with. And I'll ask you guys some questions. You have to answer them to yourself because we don't have a but what kind of duck is this? And of course, this is Florida's mottled duck, also called the Florida duck, in some references. Okay, and so in my talks, I always start with a picture of myself in the 1930s. This is me, Marvin Chandler, the very first Audubon warden on Lake Okeechobee. And we've been on Lake Okeechobee full time since 1936. So this is the 88th year of our program. Marvin is holding a water moccasin. That thing was 5 feet 11 inches long, and they were out on Kings Bar on the lake because about 95% of all the nesting glossy ibises in the state were nesting on Kings Bar, and so they were protecting it. And you notice he's got two belt buckles. One of them is actually a badge. Back in those days, we didn't have very good law enforcement, so Audubon would hire people. The state would deputize them, and they would enforce the laws. And the reason they killed that moccasin is they couldn't get around it. It was too big on the trail, so they killed it. Notice how fat it is? Well, they opened it up, and in its stomach, it had a glossy ibis egg. It had 3 tricolored heron eggs. It had another digested egg they couldn't identify. It had a baby American egret and an adult glossy ibis. So I tell everybody, if you find water moccasins, they're fun to play with. Okay, so waterfowl, I would argue, they're the ducks, geese, and swans. And I would argue that humans have a closer relationship with them than any other group of animals. And, there's a picture in here of the auroch, the precursor of modern cattle. And obviously people have a very strong relationship with cattle and with our dogs and cats and stuff. But those didn't occur on every single continent. And waterfowl people did on every single continent except Antarctica. And everywhere the people and waterfowl were together, from whatever culture, from whatever year we can get documentation, people always honed in on waterfowl. They've just been very important. And so down the lower left corner, we see this little bird that they think is a depiction of some sort of a goose or something like that. So here we are, the very first drawings, they're showing waterfowl. And this is from a relief from a tomb in Egypt. And you can see in the bottom photo, this guy's behind some type of a barrier and he's got some kind of a rope where he can pull in this thing. And the top image is a zoom in of that, what's inside of that little trap. And notice waterfowl, all kinds of ducks and geese. So the Egyptians on the Nile River were very interested in waterfowl. They're in mythology. Zeus was quite a guy, um, and he really had the hots for Leda, and she was the queen of Sparta. And so he wanted to get with her, and so he disguised himself as a swan, and he snuck up on her and had his way with her. And by the way, this is a very popular topic for artists over the centuries, and it was hard to find a general audience rated depiction of this scene. But anyway, here we are. And of course, after this happened, she laid 2 eggs, and what hatched out of them was Helen of Troy, remember the Trojan Wars, and Clytemnestra, which was her sister, who married Agamemnon, who was one of the Greek guys who fought in the Trojan War on the Greek side. And then the other egg hatched Castor and Pollux, who, if you're a Gemini in Zodiac, you know those are the Gemini twins. So anyway, waterfowl. Sure enough, I was at the Art Institute in Chicago, and here's a relief of the Egyptians with the same type of trap that we just saw. There's Zeus and Leda. And if you notice this upper right photo, notice the way they're holding the waterfowl by their wings. This is the way we hold them now. If you can take a duck or a goose and hold it right by the wings, right behind its back, it's really a perfect way to hold them. And you can hold anybody but like the biggest Canada geese who can kind of muscle through that. But it's obvious that these Egyptians were very comfortable and used to handling waterfowl. There's a constellation in the sky, Cygnus the Swan. It's also called the Northern Cross. You can see it during the summer. A very prominent constellation in the heavens of a waterfowl. And this is from a cave in Nevada. And not only this is clearly a duck decoy, but we can tell exactly what it is. It's a canvasback, the red head and the white body. And so these Native Americans not only knew what waterfowl were, but they apparently were pretty skilled at making decoys and hunting them somehow. We don't know exactly what weapons they used, but they apparently could get them. And so one of the close associations we have with waterfowls, they're domesticated. And domestic is like you can find a baby raccoon and raise it, and it's not domesticated, it's just tame until it bites you. But basically domesticated is where we create subspecies by selectively breeding them for certain characteristics. And you know, if you think about dogs, there's a zillion kind of dogs, and all those have been bred specifically. So the only 4 waterfowl in the world that have been domesticated are the gray-lag goose, and most of our domestic geese are from this. The swan goose, which was domesticated in China, mallards, and we don't know who did this first, or maybe they both did it independently, but there's a lot of mallards in old Egypt and Chinese, and Muscovy ducks. And there were Muscovies in Central America that were domesticated when the Spaniards first got here. So again, on every continent, wherever people are, wherever waterfowl are, they're interacting. And so these are pictures of domesticated geese. And again, they're selectively bred. The 3 upper right ones are gray legs, which are the most common barnyard geese. The Chinese goose has that knob on it, and so some of the domesticated geese are Chinese geese, but most of them are gray legs. And you can see the serrated mouth on the top of this gray leg. This second. Okay, never mind. Then that they use it to cut grass and stuff like that. They're herbivores. They eat a lot of vegetation. And mallards. All these things are mallards. And if you look at a breed book of mallards, it looks just like a dog book. There are so many kinds of domesticated mallards. And so the one on the left is a runner duck. It's a mallard. The little one right in the middle is called a call duck, and they're very, very vocal. And so they used them in hunting. These other ones were bred for having a poofy head or large bodies for being good to eat or something like that. But there's just a zillion kinds of domesticated mallards. So what's this a picture of? This is a pair of mallards. The little brown one is the traditional female mallard, and the other one is obviously a pekin duck. And he's a mallard. And these two can breed and have babies successfully. Um, it's just the amazing variety of mallards. And here's Muscovies. They don't have near as many varieties as mallards do, but you can see they come in different colors and forms. The one on the lower left is actually a hybrid between a mallard and a Muscovy, which is pretty remarkable, because most animals of different species can't breed together and be successful. And mallards and Muscovies are not only not the same species, they're not even the same genus, they're not even in the same tribe. They're pretty distantly related, but they still can produce a baby, which blows me away. Okay, so waterfowl have been used as guards. That's one of the, whoops, sorry. That's one of the uses of them. And dang it, sorry. I got a toolbar across the top. It's blocking some of my view. So like in one of the famous things, the city of Capitoline, or however you pronounce that, it was just part of what Rome is. And it was up on a hill. And it had a plain that sloped up to it. And the back of the city was a cliff. And so the Gauls were trying to attack the Romans, and they couldn't get through the defenses on the plain. So at night, they tried to sneak up the back cliff. They tried to climb up, and a group of geese noticed them and started squawking. And then the citizens found the gulls climbing up the hill and were able to repel them. And apparently they still have a celebration of the geese saving the city. Um, Apparently they use geese in Scotland to guard whiskey distilleries. You tell people, screamers. Now this bird right here is a screamer. It's in the waterfowl group, even though it's clearly not a traditional waterfowl. I mean, look at that beak. That's not a duck bill. That's more of a turkey bill. And obviously the feet aren't webbed, but they are very, very loud. And so the locals kept them in their villages, and they helped alert them to dangers. And of course, we have geese in barnyards across the country. And if you've ever been around geese, they're noisy and assertive. So not only we've been interested in waterfowl, but this is a book 900 years old. And this is an amazingly sophisticated book by Frederick. Um, And in it, he has hundreds and hundreds of pages of how to use falcons to capture birds. And he he actually knew when waterfowl migrated. He knew what kind of ducks were in open bays. He knew what kind of ducks were in marshes. He knew what time of year they would show up. He knew their behaviors, because if you're trying to catch them with falcons, you have to know where they are and when they are and how they work. Just a surprisingly sophisticated work from so long ago. They knew an awful lot about waterfowl. And of course, this is something we don't see as much of anymore. Down have been used for pillows and comforters and jackets. Um, this is a eider in the lower left, and they line their nest with down. And so that's a sustainable industry in some of the islands in the North Atlantic, where they just go take that down and sell it. When I lived in Missouri, there was a refuge, a Canada Goose refuge, and there was a restaurant that also had a down factory next to it. And you would go to the restaurant, you give them your geese that you shot, and while you ate breakfast, they would pluck them, and then they would sell the down to the down factories. It's a big industry, using bird feathers, especially waterfowl feathers, to make down. And of course, we have this robust hunting industry that centers on waterfowl, and really has led to a lot of work on waterfowl, and led to funding for my graduate work when I was in Texas Tech and the University of Florida. And these are some old time guns. The top one's a flintlock, like John James Audubon shot, and Alexander Wilson. The next one's a more modern weapon from the late 1800s. Anyway, lots of different kinds of guns made specifically to hunt waterfowl. And this flintlock is an interesting gun because it was used for a very long time. And there's some sayings that we use all the time that come from this gun. And one is lock, stock, and barrel. So the lock is the metal part, the trigger and the hammers. And then the stock, of course, is on the right and the barrel's on the left. So lock, stock, and barrel, so whole gun. Flash in the pan is, if you see that little orange circle right there with the hole in it, that's the pan. And with these old flintlock guns, your powder down the barrel, and then you poured in the shot or whatever you're going to shoot a bullet, and you stuffed it down with a ramrod, and then you'd put gunpowder in this pan. And see that hole that when the hammer came down, it would flash off the frizz and it'd make a spark. It should have a piece of flint in there that's not shown, but it would, if you flash the pan and the charge didn't go through the hole, then it wouldn't send off the charge. And so if you're a flash in the pan, you got the flash, but you didn't get a shot. So that's what a flash in the pan is. And then going off half cocked, those two hammers on the right, they have a setting where you can cock them halfway and they won't fire. And when you're getting ready to fire, you have to pull them all the way back, which is one more cock back. And so if you go off half cocked, you're not really ready to fire. So these three sayings that people say all the time, they came from these old flintlock guns. And of course, market hunting. That was a very big concern. Audubon, of course, was founded trying to protect birds. A lot of it was the plume birds of the Everglades, but at the same time, we also had plundered passenger pigeons and Carolina parakeets, and the bison were disappearing from the plains, and people were realizing that Americans were over harvesting wildlife and we needed to protect them. And so waterfowl were one of the things that we tried to protect. And the old guy on the left, he's got that great big long gun. He called it his headache gun. He'd take 2 aspirins before and after firing his gun. This is another kind of market gun. It's called a battery, and those barrels would go off in succession. And of course, when you're hunting for the market, you kill as many birds as you can because you want to sell as many. If you're just hunting for your family, you shoot a few birds and you go home. So market hunting was a whole different category than just regular subsistence hunting. And so part of Audubon's early efforts was to make laws to try to protect birds. And I have some interesting early attempts, like the 1850 to protect insectivorous birds. And that's because people realize that they eat caterpillars. And if you've got an orchard or a garden, and you have a bird that'll come eat your caterpillars, that's a good thing for your growing. But the laws were really hard to enforce because we had common names. And if you tried to arrest somebody for shooting a cardinal, they'd say, well, I didn't shoot a cardinal, I shot a redbird. Well, and so it was hard to get laws that were very good. And then in 1886, the AOU, the American Ornithological Union, they came up with a model law, and they realized that there's certain birds that people like to hunt, game birds. And they said, we're going to make a short list of game birds. And what are the game birds we have? The waterfowl, ducks, geese, and swans, and the gallinaceous birds, the turkeys and quail and grouse and stuff like that. And those are the two main groups of birds we hunt. There's a couple other ones like mourning doves and sandhill cranes. But they just said, here's a short list of birds that we're going to hunt, and we're going to set seasons, and we're going to set limits. So we're still going to let you hunt them, but we're going to be restrained and not hunt to the extent where we wipe them out. And in 1901, Florida adopted the Audubon Model Bird Law. And it's funny because that law, Frank Chapman was one of the founders of the AOU and also of Audubon. He's the one that started our Christmas bird counts. And he was one of the people who helped figure out the model bird law. Gilbert Pearson was one of our first presidents, and in his memoirs, he writes about going from state to state and getting this model bird law passed. And he'd go, I went to North Carolina and it passed, and I went to Virginia and it passed, and I went to Connecticut and it passed. And I thought, how could this guy just go into a state legislature and get them to pass a law to tell their citizens to quit shooting birds that obviously the citizens like to shoot? It just seemed really strange that he could get that done. And it wasn't until I read this book by Leslie Kemp Poole, she's a professor at Rollins College, it was women. The early Audubon movement, the very first movement to call itself Audubon was George Bird Grinnell. He was the editor of Forest and Stream magazine, Field and Stream Now. And he started a pamphlet and sent it out and was trying to, especially targeting kids and saying, we need to protect our wildlife and treasure them and be more respectful. But within 4 years, he had tens of thousands of subscriptions and he had to stop. But then a few years later, some women in Massachusetts got together and they made a Massachusetts Audubon Society. In 1900, Clara Domerich started the Florida Audubon Society. And Clara's board of directors was a who's who. She had 2 former American presidents, 2 former governors, the president of Rollins College. Her husband was a very wealthy industrialist, of Reverend Whipple, who was quite a character and did a lot of stuff. Anyway, so when Pearson got to Florida or North Carolina, the women had already taken care of it. They already had talked to the legislature or the governor, and they said, you're going to pass this law. And so that was really the very first laws that got passed protecting birds. And it was 1916. Let's go back. Yeah, 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act passed. And rather than have all these different state laws, the federal government passed a law that was modeled after the model bird law. And that now is our framework for hunting. And most people don't know that, but it was the Audubon Society that really got that going. And bird conservation, particularly plume birds, but also waterfowl and other things were really a motivation for that. The only duck we know of that's gone extinct is the Labrador duck. We don't know exactly what happened to it. It never appeared to be real abundant. But Todd McGrain did this project where he started making these 6-foot statues of extinct birds and putting them the very last place the bird was ever seen. And his motto is because forgetting is a second extinction. And so there's a Carolina parakeet that's at the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. That's where they were last sighted. There's a heath hen on Martha's Vineyard. There's a great auk on some island off Nova Scotia. And there's a passenger pigeon in Michigan where the last ones were shot. And he was recently commissioned to do an Eskimo curlew, and it's in Texas. So this is just some of the inspiration that waterfowl and other birds have given people. So not only we were trying to get people to quit shooting waterfowl, but we wanted to help fix habitat. And so Ding Darling was one of the first secretaries of the Interior under Roosevelt, and he started the duck stamp. And it said, if you want to hunt ducks in the country, you've got to buy this stamp. And I think it was like $1 or something like that. It wasn't very much, but they were going to use the money to buy places to try to restore habitat, because he was seeing, not only we were overshooting, but we were draining and we were changing the landscape. And but basically we needed to do more to protect waterfowl. And so there's books about this, and he writes about any old duck marsh 25 years ago and why it seems to be time to start talk of conservation, especially after World War II, and everybody came back from the war and they were all good with guns. Everybody was out hunting. And so anyway, this was part of the conservation movement was centered on trying to protect waterfowl from overharvest while still harvesting them, still having duck hunting. And of course, Ducks Unlimited is a very large conservation group who actually, I was just reading today, they've saved 1 million acres of wetland habitat this past year. And here's some other things about raising more waterfowl, and the upper right one is from the National Association of Audubon Societies, trying to figure out how to protect and preserve waterfowl. And there's, of course, a big industry about it. There's all kinds of decoys that people use to hunt waterfowl, very specialized technologies, and boats. The boat on the right is a typical little marsh boat. You pull it into the weeds and hunt from it. There's all kinds of designs of these. The box on the left is called a sink box. That was used on big bays where you didn't have weeds to hide in. And you notice he's sitting there with a platform around him. Those decoys on the platform are made out of lead. And the reason they're made out of lead is he's got to sink that box down to be flush with the surface of the water. And these sink boxes are now illegal. They were deemed too effective at harvest. And so they said, okay, we're going to let you hunt ducks, but we're not going to let you be that good at it. They also were really dangerous because if you're out in the middle of a big bay and waves come up, you can see that you'd swamp that thing pretty fast. And so they had to have a tender boat. But this is just all the focus that people have had on ducks in America and elsewhere. Would you buy a decoy for $1.1 million? Collecting decoys is quite the thing. Elmer Kroll actually made working decoys. This does not look like a working decoy. This looks like more of an artsy one. But anyway, collecting decoys is pretty big business by people because they're striking. And so the book on the left is a book about how to paint decoys. The book on the right is Roger Torrey Peterson's first field guide. And Peterson, when he made his field guide in 1930s, binoculars were not very good back then. And instead of the very detailed paintings like we get like with the Sibley guide nowadays, where he paints every feather and stuff, Peterson was just trying to show people what would this duck look like if it was a quarter mile out on a bay. And this is all you could see. And you notice that the decoy patterns and his identification patterns were very similar because they were just a simplistic view of what that duck would look like. Remember that little call duck I told you about, the mallard? They actually used to hunt with live decoys. And Dad had an old fart that he knew up in Missouri, that had been a commercial fisherman on the river and had hunted over live ducks. And he said he had some of their collars. And I'm like, you do? And he took me and showed them to me. And they're just like a dog collar, but they're duck size. So anyway, he gave me three of them. He said, here, you can have them. So anyway, these are the collars. And now it is illegal to hunt over live decoys, over live ducks, because again, we're trying to make hunting possible, but not too destructive. And so the Labrador Retriever is a dog that was originally uh, raised up in Labrador and Newfoundland for fishing boats, and they would pull lines between boats out in the North Sea, and they had to be very cold tolerant and able to swim. But people learned that they could be very good duck hunting dogs too. And so the Labrador Retriever has been the most popular breed in the United States for 31 years running, just because not only they hunt ducks, but they're really great dogs. They've been displaced. Just in the last year, another dog has finally knocked them off the top. And does anybody know what it is? French Bulldog. I had to look them up. They call them Frenchies. Anyway, but the labs are very, very popular birds, or dogs. And this is my old lab, Coot, and he's not with me anymore. This is my new lab. He's not this cute anymore, but he's a real sweetheart. This is Cricket. And so not only Labradors are duck hunting dogs, but there's a bunch of different kinds of duck hunting dogs. And if you've ever seen Duck Dynasty or heard of it, they sell duck hunting apparel. And this is Uncle Si, and he talks with such a strong Cajun accent. They use subtitles when he talks. But here he is hunting with a poodle, because poodles actually originally were used for duck hunting. And so there's Uncle Si with his duck dog. And this is a dog I've never seen. These are called tolling retrievers. And for some reason, they run down to the shore of the water and jump around and yap and carry on, and ducks will swim over to look at them. I don't know why that happens, but they've used these things to hunt, or they'll try to get the ducks to come close enough where you can get a shot at them. They've used them to attract ducks into traps when they're trying to ban ducks, and they'll lead the ducks into the trap and then they close the trap. So this is one of those things I just don't understand, but I know about it. So they even have dogs that just attract ducks by acting zany. And of course, here's the part, and this is something that all of us have experienced in all the time. Almost all of the major parks have waterfowl in them, where it seems like it. And so I remember this old Gary Larson cartoon, and it's Anatidaeophobia, and Anatidae is the family of the waterfowl. And I was wondering when I was making this talk if that's really a real thing. And so I Googled it and I immediately got a bunch of hits. I'm like, wow, maybe it's a real thing. But when I looked it up, it was just Larson's cartoon. So if you're afraid of ducks, that you've got this condition, a fear that somewhere, somehow a duck is watching you. So we have them in our yards, just like we put out wren boxes or bluebird boxes, we put out wood duck boxes. And in Missouri, they used to put out tubs that Canada geese would nest in. There's so many geese nowadays that I don't know if many people do this anymore, but again, just something to attract waterfowl to be around us. And here's a brood of waterfowl, Canada geese. And I'll talk more about this later. I'm going to talk more about waterfowl biology after we go through our relationships. But you notice both parents are there. That's one of the characteristics of geese, is both parents mate for life and they take care of their young together. Here's a black-bellied whistling duck. This was taken down in South Texas when I was in graduate school at Texas Tech. And back then, in the 80s, black-bellied whistling ducks only made it as far north as Corpus Christi. Now they've spread all the way across the Gulf Rim, and there's clear up into the Carolinas. And why they exploded like that, we don't really understand, but now they're all over the place, and you can hear them flying and squeaking around. They're pretty neat ducks. And art. Jack Weaves was a very famous illustrator of a lot of the old field guides and ornithology books. This is one that he painted just of widgeons, because he and his wife had this beautiful vision, and this used to hang above his mantle, his firewood mantle at his house. So just art for art's sake. Fuertes also was a very famous painter. This is kind of the Audubon style of a dramatic painting of a peregrine falcon with a green-winged teal. And by the way, my dog's name Kreka, that's the species name of a green-winged teal. But again, these captivating photos and illustrations that people like to see of waterfowl. And Thayer was an interesting guy. He thought wood ducks were camouflaged, and he did these illustrations to try to show that. A lot of people have argued that they're in a dappled environment in the forest, and so they don't actually show up. If you take them out and put them in the sunlight, they're brilliant. But if you put them in a dappled forest, they kind of blend in. So Thayer actually was a pretty famous artist, and he gave a lot of money to the early Audubon to hire wardens and do different work to conserve birds. And sculptures in Omaha, Nebraska, they have the spirit of Nebraska's wilderness, and they have these waterfowl that are in downtown Omaha. They have other things. They have bison statues and wagon and stuff like that. But again, waterfowl adorning the art of our cities. And the range of decoys that goes from the functional decoys of the upper left to kind of a stylistic one that you might have sitting on your book cabinet, to a very detailed bird sculpture. Lots of interest in waterfowl. And it's part of folklore. Winter's not gone yet if the wild geese fly that way. Growing up in Missouri, that was one of the things that I noticed in fall. You know, the geese would show up and they'd be very loud and they'd be up in these big V's in the sky, and they're a harbinger of the changing of the seasons. And when they leave, everything gets quiet. And so, again, just something that they've influenced people all across the world. And this is Lois Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge, right near where I grew up and where I went hunting with Dad, not on the refuge, but around it. And these are snow geese. And this might be part of the reason I'm sitting here in this chair right now. Back then, they had 300,000 snow geese that would stay there during the winter. Now that's up to 1 million. When they take off, it is absolutely deafening. And snow geese fly around in flocks of like 10,000 birds in one flock. It's just they'll stretch out for like miles, and they all fly. They all land in the field, and it's just a spectacular thing to see. And one time when I was going to give this talk, just during the day, I got on Facebook this decoration of an autumn scene, and it has a stylized swan, and then this joke about ducks, you know, waterproof that chicken and give it a kazoo. So again, just they're everywhere. And so these are trumpeter swans by Robert Bateman. This is almost a landscape painting. And we've used swans for all kinds of things: meat, feathers, skin, eggs, quills, art recovery. We're all familiar with different names for males and female animals. Like if you have cattle, there's a bull and a cow. If you have a chicken, there's a rooster and a hen. Swans have special names too. And the male is called a cob, and the female is called a pen, P-E-N. And if you see over there on the right, quills, there's the coincidence here. These guys are signing the Declaration of Independence, and what are they writing with? Quill pens. And this device on the right is called a pen. It's named after the female swan. When they invented ballpoint pens about 100 years ago and they replaced the quill pens, they just naturally called this writing tool a pen. And so every time you use a pen, realize that it was named after the female swan. And we use quill pens for like 1,000 years. The Magna Carta was written and signed with quill pens. And so these have been very, very functional. And one more thing, when you took the quill and you carved it into a pen with a knife, what kind of knife did you use to carve a quill? You used a pen knife. So this is something I only learned about a year ago. I've been giving this talk for years, and somehow I figured this out. I was like, holy cow, I didn't even realize that. But anyway, so there's a pen. Okay, so that's kind of our relationship to waterfowl in the world. It's obviously a quick run of it, but I think everybody can kind of see that we have a lot of interactions with waterfowl. So I'm going to talk about what are the ducks and geese and swans, what are their characteristics, and then we'll talk a little bit about the life history of Florida's mottled duck, since that's what I worked on. But there's about 170 species of ducks, geese, and swans in the world. About 60 of them occur in North America. So we have about 1/3 of all the species of waterfowl in the world. There have been 42 species recorded in Florida. Um, but 12 of them are kind of accidental or irregular, things like some European ducks or something like that. But we regularly get about 30 species of waterfowl in Florida. And so they're in the Anseriformes, and that's the order. And these are basic characteristics of waterfowl, but for every single one of these, I can show you a waterfowl that doesn't follow the rule. But they've got that flat duck bill, flattened bill, thin, soft membrane. They tend to have long necks, especially swans and geese, but also ducks. They mostly have pointed wings. They're very fast flyers. Now the whistling ducks are an exemption to that. They have rounded wings, but most ducks have long pointed wings and they fly really fast. They have flattened, elongated bodies. And you have to think about a duck as a boat. It's got to float, it's got to be stable. And so they're wide. And that's part of the reason they waddle so much is their feet are so far apart that their center of weight changes. And that joke about, the give that chicken a kazoo and waterproof it. Well, chickens have in the grouse, they have their legs very close together. They're tall and thin, and they can run very, very well. And ducks are short and fat, short and broad, and they don't walk real well, but although they can walk, but they're not fast or anything. So that's part of the reason why ducks waddle so much. They have webbed feet for swimming and scaled legs. If you're gonna have your legs in the water all the time, you don't want to have wet feathers. They have contour feathers. Like if you take their chest feathers and lift them up, you'll see down underneath them. And that gives them the double insulation. They line their nest with it. So they have 2 layers of feathers, not one like a lot of birds. Simultaneous wing molt. When they molt their flight feathers, they drop all of them at the same time. And for a month, they cannot fly. If you look at hawks flying around, you'll see that they'll have one feather missing on their primaries and secondaries. And what they do is they molt one feather at a time and regrow it, and they molt the next feather and regrow it. And that way they never lose their ability to fly. But waterfowl can lose their ability to fly because they live in wetlands and they can just go hide in the weeds for a month. It's a hard way to do things, but that's what they do. They molt all their flight feathers at once and grow a completely new set of feathers. And then their young are precocious. As soon as they hatch, like if you've had a wood duck box, as soon as they hatch, they pop out of the box and they go off with mom, and they live away from the nest from day one. So those are general characteristics. And if you look at the ducks that are common in Florida, and this is kind of a made up list, I put little red asterisks next to ducks that are very common, but all these other ducks and geese show up here pretty regularly. And some of this is a little bit subjective. But these are all different kinds of ducks that we can see in Florida, which is a pretty impressive list. And the sea ducks, golden eyes and scoters, niders, they tend to be way out and they're hard. I don't really have a good knowledge of how common they are. We see almost all of them in Florida from time to time, but they're offshore and they're kind of hard to notice. But again, we have a really nice diversity of waterfowl in Florida. And then we have the weirdos. I had some water management people tell me one time when I was putting the boat in, they said, "Oh, there's a really weird goose down there," And I thought, well, it's probably a musco. I went down there, ruddy-shelled duck. They weren't banded. It was a pair. They're native to Europe and Asia and Africa, and what it was doing there, I don't know. But that's one of the things about waterfowl is they're very good flyers and they can show up anywhere. And most of our waterfowl are migratory. We don't really have that many birds, waterfowl that nest here. The only 3 commonly nesting birds historically were the mottled duck, the wood duck, and the hooded merganser. And the fulvous and black-bellied whistling ducks have only shown up within the last 100 years. Fulvous whistling ducks always show up if you start growing rice, and we grow a lot of rice in the Everglades agricultural area. The black-bellies I mentioned, they just spread across the Gulf Rim, and we didn't even do it. And then, of course, we have these muscovies and mallards that have been released in all of our parks. And so all these ducks that are migrating here, if you notice on this map, you have these really black lines, and it goes up to what we call the prairie pothole region. And that's one of the biggest duck factories in the world. When we think about the Everglades, we might have had the largest nesting colonies of wading birds anywhere in the world. Well, the prairie pothole region is that for waterfowl. It's a glaciated area that has just all kinds of ponds, and a whole bunch of our birds nest in the prairie pothole region. But of course, they nest all over the boreal forest and all the way up to Alaska and all kinds of other places. So what we get mostly from our waterfowl are we get birds here that are wintering here and not breeding here. And an interesting thing about our waterfowl is we have some of the most colorful and exotic waterfowl in the world. And part of the reason we think is because they're all in the prairie pothole region and they're all together and they're all closely related. And so we have things that are very distinctive, like this shoveler and this wood duck, and the canvasback and the redhead kind of look the same. They're kind of an exception of being very unique. But again, look at the pintail up here on the upper left, very distinct from the green-winged teal, from the cinnamon teal, from the blue-winged teal, or from the widgeon. And part of that is we think they just needed to be able to be very good at not interbreeding and producing, strange offspring. And they interbreed all the time. I mean, we get hybrids that show up pretty regularly, but we think their distinctiveness was to help them make sure that they don't make mistakes. And that distinctiveness also gives us some of the prettiest waterfowl because they're all jammed in these little areas. Again, all these ducks are breeding in the prairie pothole region and elsewhere, but they're all in that area. And so here's a map of somewhere in North Dakota, and you can just see all these wetlands and all the opportunity for waterfowl breeding. And this is really the waterfowl, the duck factory, as a lot of people call it in North America. Again, not the only place, but a really high percent of ducks nesting there. Okay, so in the ducks, we have two basic groups, the swans and geese and whistling ducks, and then we have the true ducks or the common ducks. And so the differences between them, remember I showed you the picture of the Canada geese. Well, they mate for life and both parents care for their young. And ducks, like mallards and teal, they mate seasonally. The male and female mate. The female does all the work for the young. Once she lays her nest, she has to go sit on it, and the guy just takes off and leaves her by herself. The swans and geese have relatively longer necks than ducks, but of course, all of them have a pretty long neck. Geese, their voice boxes are the same, so they both sound, both members, male and female goose, honk. But ducks have different voices, and the females tend to do the quacking, quack, 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 that you hear mallards do. But if you hear a Drake mallard, he's got a quiet reb, and they also do some peeps and some other things, but the male and female sound different. And they also have dimorphic plumage. The male is colorful and the female's drab. Of course, she's got to sit on the nest, so she doesn't want to be showy. Um, and and for the geese, they have the male and female look the same in plumage. And then the other thing is geese only molt their feathers once a year. They molt their flight feathers and their body feathers all about the same time. And ducks will actually have 2 to 3 annual molts. Then the male, he'll be bright during the breeding season. He'll molt into a drab plumage. He looks a lot like the female during the winter, and then he'll molt back into his bright plumage in the fall. They only molt their flight feathers one time, but the rest of their body feathers, they molt 2 or 3 times. So those are some differences between geese and swans. And one of the great joys of having birds wintering here is a lot of these ducks will pair during the winter. And so these guys aren't telling jokes. They're trying to impress this girl here, say, hey, look at me. And so they have all these very ritualistic behaviors they do to try to show off for the hens. And if you can find wintering ducks that are doing their breeding courtship, it's really a spectacle to see. It's just so much fun. And, these guys are obviously in full plumage and they're beautiful and they're doing everything they can to get this girl's attention. These are dabbling ducks. They have a little bit different things. The mallard on the lower right, he's doing the grunt whistle, where he kind of rears up and he does a and you can hear it. You don't even have to be at the pond. You can hear him doing it from a distance, and you can go over and see him. And that little green-winged teal in the lower left, that's called the head up, tail up. And if you look right above him, there's a mallard doing a head up, tail up. They're closely related. They do the same thing. And there's a male mallard in the upper right-hand corner of that picture doing the grunt whistle. So again, they're all vying for the attention of these females. Then there's stiff-tailed ducks, the ruddy ducks. They're just goofy. They're different from everybody. In the upper left, he's blowing bubbles. They actually he bats his bill against his chest and makes this bubbling sound. And the one on the bottom is called the ringing rush, and he runs across the water and hits his wings on the water, goes pop, pop, and you can hear it from a long way. And again, you know, the different kinds of ducks and geese have different courtships. Some of the ducks are just hilarious to watch. And so here's a real common picture you see um, in duck magazines and stuff is all these beautiful, colorful males. Notice there's only one female. And this is actually not the nicest thing to see because what happens is female ducks are less abundant than males. And we think it's because she has to sit on the nest, she has to raise the babies, she's got a much harder life. And so there aren't as many females around. And so when they get paired, she may have a mate. One of these shovelers might be her mate, but all the other unpaired shovelers will get around her and start harassing her. And he'll try to defend her, but he can't necessarily do that. And so, like when I worked for FWC and I was in the waterfowl section, we get calls from people that in the local county park there would be mallards and there'd be gangs of males ganging up on females, and it's really not very pleasant to watch. And sometimes they even can kill the females. But this is just part of what happens with waterfowl and their skewed sex ratio. And so I see these pictures all the time, and everybody's like, "Oh, isn't that beautiful?" And I'm kind of like, "Yeah, well, they're being ducks." But anyway, I mean, there's no value judgment in that. It's just that's the way they work. Okay, so I was working on Florida ducks, and one of my friends drew me a picture of a Florida duck. So I'm going to talk about my work on Florida ducks, mottled ducks. So here's a nest, and after they get done with their courtship, they make a nest. And if you notice, there's 3, 6, 9, 10 eggs visible here. Now, the female mottled duck, she'll lay one egg a day for about 10 days to 2 weeks. And she weighs 1,000 grams, and each one of these eggs weighs 50 or 60. And so you think about if she lays 10 50-gram eggs, she's laid 500 grams of eggs. She only weighs 1,000 grams. She's laid half her body weight in less than 2 weeks. And this is really, really hard for a female to do, obviously, to put out that much stuff. And the way she does it is she gets really, really fat before she lays her eggs. And she has this big greasy layer of fat in her skin. And while she's laying, she lives off that fat. That's her energy. And she sits there in the pond all day and she eats bugs and snails. And snails, of course, have calcium for the shells because she's got to produce this egg one a day. She'll take a breather after every fourth or fifth day sometimes, but she's got to lay all this. And by the time she gets done laying, she may weigh 800 to 850 grams, not 1,000. She loses a lot of weight. And then she's got to start sitting on the nest. And the thing about duck eggs is they don't start developing. They're just like a seed. Until you put the seed in the soil and water it, it won't start growing. It just sits there. And so she lays one egg a day, and they just sit there and wait. And when she starts sitting on them, they all start developing. And that's so they can all hatch at the same time and they can all leave the nest together. If you look at a lot of the songbirds, they only have like 4 eggs because their babies are helpless. And so they have to feed them. And if you got to feed 4 mouths, it's way easier than feeding 10. So she can lay a lot more eggs because once these babies hatch out, she just leaves them around and they feed themselves. And it gives her the strength in numbers, but it's also so energetically costly. And by the time she gets done incubating, it takes a little bit more than 3 weeks to incubate. She may be down to 700 to 750 grams. So she can lose like 1/4 or even 1/3 of her body weight from the rigors of this. And again, this is part of the reason why the skewed sex ratio. Now, the good thing is once these eggs hatch, the babies are on the go and they can feed themselves and she can feed herself. And so she starts building her reserves back up. Of course, the male's long gone. And so she can recover that lost body weight and lost strength while she's raising these little babies. And here's wing. After she gets done with her babies, she's got to go back and let's see. She's got to go back and start getting ready for wing molt. And so she's going to drop all of her flight feathers. So one of the things she's got to do is get fat again because she's going to be stuck on some pond. And if it's not a very good pond, she's going to be there for a month before those feathers are big enough for her to fly. And so she gets fat again and she goes to the pond. And while they grow their feathers, they lose weight again. The males leave earlier than her, and they also regain weight when they're defending a territory during breeding. They also lose a whole lot of weight. So they build back up, they do their wing molt. And so here is a group of ducks out on a pond. This is out on a ranch in Okeechobee County. And these are all flightless ducks. And when I worked for Game and Fish, this is when we'd ban ducks. We'd go out in right now in August, September, and catch these ducks while they were flightless and put bans on them. And then we would, that's the best way to ban ducks. So this is, again, really big stress and something that they can do. They mostly hide in the weeds during the daytime and they'll come out at night and feed, but they're stuck on the water for a month. Now, I'm going to wrap up here in a minute. Now, if you're a migratory waterfowl, you're up in the prairie pothole region, you just bred, you did your wing molt, and now you got to migrate south. Well, they get fat for a third time, and they have to finance that migration. Model ducks don't get as fat before migration as the migratory birds do, because, of course, they don't really have anywhere to go because they live here all the time. But this is the life of birds, that they use body fat to finance very expensive, energetically expensive parts of their life. And this is ducks doing that too. So back to the conservation message, here's Ding Darling again, and he talks about how man improves on nature. We made a bunch of refuges, and the National Wildlife Refuge System is only one of many things we've used to restore wetlands and help birds. This is a picture of a black-capped chickadee on a waterfowl area in Missouri. It's removing a fecal sac, and I like this picture. This is like 50 years old probably. Because it reflects that when we do this wetland restoration work, we are actually saving not only waterfowl, but other types of birds as well. And if you look at trends of North American birds in groups like grassland birds, they have really seriously declined. And the wetland related birds in North America actually have fared much better. And part of it is because of this deliberate effort to help restore wetlands and protect wetlands and do things to help them. And so waterfowl are not the only reason we restore wetlands, but they're certainly a very big one. And they've been a big driver in a lot of conservation work, not just in setting hunting seasons and regulations, but also in habitat restoration and management. And so here's, what we like to see. And I work for Audubon and I work on Lake Okeechobee, and up here in the Okeechobee watershed, we're trying to restore all the wetlands we can, mostly to try to help Lake Okeechobee and slow down the water that glugs into it after, big storms. But also just, it's habitat. This is habitat for wading birds and for waterfowl and everything else. And I'll close it with a quote from Ding Darling. Of course, you realize I'm not nearly so much interested in the preservation of migratory waterfowl as I am in the management of water resources and the crucial effects of such management upon human sustenance. Wild ducks and geese and teeter-ass shorebirds are only the delicate indicators of the prognosis for human existence, just as sure as God made little green apples. And again, most of my work with Audubon is water. And it's water for birds in the long run, but it's water for a lot of things and for us in the long run. So I will stop there. If you're not tired of me droning on and on, there's some different presentations that have been recorded on the Audubon website, and you can get talks by me and other people about our Birds of Prey Center, our coastal programs, or Corkscrew, or a lot of the different things we do. So if you like these webinars, go look at our page and you can kind of find them. So with that, I'll turn the floor back over to you guys and we can take questions or whatever you want to do.
Hey, thanks, Paul. That was great. I think my favorite part was that Helen of Troy was hatched from an egg, and that Zeus, inadvertently started the Trojan War. Like, crazy. All right. So we do have some questions in the chat that just disappeared off my screen. Hold on. Come back. That would be amazing. All right, here we go. Here's the chat. So everybody really enjoyed the presentation. Joanna Crilly says that she believes the great auk statue is off Fogo Island off of Newfoundland. So when you were talking about the statues of the extinct bird. So First question is from Blake Scarborough.
Yeah,
She
and
says,
and thanks for
oh,
that, because I've not been sure where exactly it is. I've seen pictures of it, but yeah, it's up there somewhere, and someday I hope to get there.
yeah, I love the idea of doing that. That's really nice. All right, so Blake Scarborough says, I've seen a whistling duck kick out an entire beehive from a nesting box. Do you know how bee stings affect ducks slash feathers?
No, I do not. That surprises me. There is concern about whistling ducks kicking wood ducks out, and I don't know how big a concern that is, but I had no idea they could get rid of bees. That's pretty impressive.
Jeannie Mauser just had a comment that the Egyptian goose has become very common in our area. They're mean. They chase me when I go check the mail.
Yeah,
Kevin Baker would like to know, can the interbred ducks breed?
some of them can. Usually they cannot, but again, their waterfowl are so much more plastic in their ability to crossbreed that the rules for most other animals don't apply. They're pretty good at crossbreeding.
Kay Gates would like to know if you know of anywhere that you can easily see mergansers in Florida.
Um, there are actually, I was looking at the comments, and there's a few people who have them around in their backyards and in peaceful waters. But places like Merritt Island and even the Wakatahatchee, or however you say that, um, hooded mergansers are kind of secretive. They like to be back in the woods and heavy areas. So sometimes it's just if you look closely and look at the little sheltered areas, that you might be able to get a glimpse of them.
So Blake again says, at Green Cay, we had a unique case where a wood duck laid eggs in a cavity, then a whistling duck laid eggs. The wood duck ended up with both wood and whistling duck babies. Does that affect the whistling duck babies being raised by the wood duck mother behaviors as they have different characteristics?
Okay, yeah. So that's called nest parasitism, and I forgot to mention that. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, a lot of ducks, and especially wood ducks and whistling ducks and redheads, are very famous for laying eggs in other ducks' nests. And there was a study in Missouri where there weren't very many wood ducks around, and a female wood duck would come add an egg or two to different broods, and it actually was increasing clutch sizes, and so it was leading to an increase in wood ducks. So one of the students that worked on that said, "This is great. This nest parasitism actually boosts the population." Well, once their population got great big, they would dump so many eggs in the nest. Sometimes there'd be like 100 in there, and it would ruin the nest. And so then the next student is like, "Well, that first person was crazy because this is clearly detrimental." And so it kind of comes and goes both ways. And there's a duck, a stiff-tailed duck. Remember the ruddy duck I showed a picture of? They do the ringing rush and all that. They lay the biggest eggs of any ducks, and the female ruddy duck can actually lay a clutch that weighs more than she does. And when their babies hatch out, they are just super ready to go. They're really big, they're really robust. And so there's one kind of stiff tail down in South America. I think it's called the black-headed duck. And it's a nest parasite, and it never raises its own babies. And it lays this egg in somebody else's nest, that and sometimes even like in gallinule nests. And that mother incubates it. And when that baby hatches, it just leaves and raises itself. So that's how precocial waterfowl can be. So this nest dumping is something that's common. It can be good at low densities and bad at high densities, but it happens all the time.
That's amazing. Um, my mind is blown by that duck. All right, so Kevin Baker, like you pointed out, he says that he had some hooded mergansers wintering in the canal behind his home in Palm Beach Gardens. Lorraine Moorcroft says that she saw some in peaceful waters and definitely Merritt Island. Sheila McCormick says, excellent talk. Thank you. Karen says, that was so informative. Thank you for your conservation work. Carol Watson, what a great lesson on ducks. Sabina says, it was very informative. Learned so much. Thank you. Oh, so Blake says, what is your favorite waterfowl?
I don't pick favorite kids. Um, you know, I just love a lot of them. And like I said, I named my dog after the green-winged teal species name, which was really a dumb thing because no one's ever heard of Krekka. And so they always say, "What's his name?" I'm like, "Krekka." And they're like, "What?" So anyway, but I just love them all.
That was the best picture of your dog, by the way, as a puppy. Um, all right. So wonderful presentation. Thank you, says Danielle. Um, thank you so much. This was a great presentation, Paul. Which waterfowl have you seen become more common over the years? That's from Layla.
Definitely the black-bellied whistling duck. It's probably the waterfowl explosion. Snow geese have become super abundant in the Midwest. Uh, and there was a lot of talk about them eating out the tundra that they nested on, but now we're realizing that sea level rise is drowning some of the tundra. So whether snow geese are at fault or whether it's climate change, that's still kind of in the air. Canada geese, I mentioned the tubs. The giant Canada goose was nearly extinct, and once they started breeding them in ponds and putting out tubs and stuff, their populations have exploded, and now they're considered a nuisance bird all across the Midwest. And yeah, but it's an abundance of wealth. So yeah, there have been certain waterfowl that have really come on. A lot of the prairie pothole ducks have gone up, but then they also go down. So they're kind of holding their own. But yeah, there have been some success stories with waterfowl, and also the not the trumpeter swan. Oh yeah, the trumpeter swan. They were down to less than maybe 100 birds, and they were holding out on this one refuge in Montana, Red Rocks, and they started a breeding program for them 40 years ago, and now there are tens of thousands of them all across the country. So again, that's one of those breeding programs that really paid off. They don't breed them anymore. They're doing fine now that we protect them from overharvest. And so, yeah, there have been, these are success stories that we need to celebrate a little bit more rather than we get so much doom and gloom, but there's good things happening too.
I couldn't agree with you more. We need to share the success stories more to show that conservation efforts work.
Yeah.
Cherry says, how difficult has it been when different federal administrations enact laws to change the definition of wetlands? On the other hand, I was thrilled to hear of the 1,000,000 acres of wetlands that were protected.
Yes. The recent rulings by the Supreme Court on wetlands and what's protected by the federal government are very disheartening. It's very, very unscientific the way they look at the connections between wetlands, and what people do on their property in their wetlands matters to everybody, because if they drain that wetland, all that water gets dumped on people downstream of them, and it creates bigger surges during the summer. And then during the winter, you don't have stream flow because all the water's gone from your watershed. That's part of Okeechobee's problem is the watershed's so drained that we drain all the water into the lake in 1 month. It used to take 6. And so the lake gets really deep and we dump water and everybody gets mad. And then during the winter, there's no base flow. The lake goes down really fast. And so all these isolated wetlands are not isolated at all. They're connected by the water table under the ground. And what you do in that wetland affects all the rest of us. And I think we should have a hand in what happens to that wetland and what you can do with it, because what you do on your own property is your business until it crosses your property line and becomes our problem. And then we have a say in what you do. So anyway, that's a little preaching, but um, we need to get better wetland protection because it matters.
Carol says, terrific presentation, Paul. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your stories. Harvey says, fantastic talk. Thank you. Cherry says, thanks for the waterfall details. I didn't know and how great for you to present a fun and fascinating program with positive outcomes. So Scott says, what an informative presentation. Thank you. Is there any research on whether hybrid ducks have greater mortality rates or whether they have different breeding success?
Not that I know of. And the reason is there aren't very many of them. And so when you get a cross between something, if they go north, we don't really know what happened to them. So I don't think we really understand that very well. Hybrids tend to be sterile, but again, in waterfowl, they're not always. So it's just hard. But the number of hybrids in the population always has been very low. So it's not like they're getting more and more abundant or something like that. So again, the answer is I don't really know.
Jeanette says, I love the presentation, great information. James says, great presentation. We could listen to you all night. Deborah says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. April, great presentation. Shelley says, thank you so much for the amazing presentation to everybody at Audubon that makes these great programs possible. Lorraine says, are we doing a disservice to black belly whistling ducks and mottled ducks by feeding them duck feed when they bring their ducklings to our yard in new development where they've lost their habitat and now rely on stormwater ponds?
There's some disagreement about that, but I don't think you're hurting them. I mean, we have bird feeders in our yard and they supplement the birds' diets. If you feed them bread, it's a grain. And so if all they ate was bread, they would be malnourished, but they go back to the pond and they eat bugs and stuff like that. So I think feeding birds, the other thing is if you bring them up in your yard and the dogs get after them, that could be bad. Or if they get run over by cars by roaming around your neighborhood, that's bad. But I just think feeding birds is not necessarily a bad activity. But there's some people who would disagree with me on that.
It's a hot topic for sure.
Yeah.
All right, Lillian says, thank you for another wonderful presentation. Susan says, thank you very much for the informative presentation. Many thanks from Ottawa. CJ said, thank you. This was such an informative and interesting presentation. Thank you, Paul. So that's all the questions in the chat for right now. So I just want to say thank you. I very much enjoyed your presentation. I liked all the links to history, the Egyptians carrying the birds by the wings. It was really cool to link it in like that. So thank you so much.
I'm happy to hear from Ottawa because we go fishing, being from Missouri, on Lake of the Woods in Ontario, and red-breasted mergansers nest on those boreal lakes, and they come down here to the Intercoastal Waterway, and I'll see them on our beaches. So I see them in both parts of their migration. So we share birds with Canada, and while we're down here, we try to take care of them as well as we can.
Oh, that's cool. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and share a screen. Thank you, my behind the scenes person. You guys get to see the magic behind the mystery today, or the mystery behind the magic. All right, so everybody, thank you again so much for being here today. I just want to remind you that our upcoming presentation next month is on October 1st with photographer Anthony Sleelman, Capturing the Night. So it's going to be a really interesting presentation. And just a reminder, if you have not renewed your membership or if you want to become a member of Audubon Everglades, join and you can see more presentations like this. Join us on our field trips. We are a fun group of people. So we will put the link in the chat for you to be able to join. You can also just visit our website or use the QR code on the screen to go ahead and become a member of Audubon Everglades. And with that, just thank you all so much for being here. We do everything that we do for you guys. So if you have comments, questions, or want to join in on the fun, feel free to join us. And yeah, with that, have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.